more than exciting to see everyone again in person. I've been speaking to a few of you. I understand it's our first time back in in-person conferences, so thank you for doing this. And most importantly, thank you to the 4 panelists here with me this morning. As mentioned, really thrilled and delighted to have such an esteemed group of subject matter experts to talk us through some of the innovations and progression that we're seeing in the healthcare system. For the discussion, we're going to kind of really focus on that. Call this panel, if you will, a little bit of a pivot in our agenda. But what I'd really like to do is unearth some of the most innovative and progressive movements in the healthcare ecosystem. So why don't we just jump right into it and start right there. I'll pose this question to all 4 of you, but I'd love to just hear a little bit about where our respective panelists are seeing some of the most exciting innovation in the healthcare ecosystem. Annie, maybe if I can start with you.
Sure. So I have to explain that I invest in technology-enabled solutions and services in healthcare, so I'm not a biotech and life science investor. So when I think about innovation, it's really about the system and the $1 trillion of waste and the lack of access and really reformation of the system. And I think, the issue there is technology is not the issue when it comes to healthcare innovation. The software is there, the AI is there, the robotic process automation is there, the data analytics. It's really about behavior change, and it's about payment reform. And so when I think about innovation, actually COVID was the most important accelerant that we've ever had in terms of healthcare services and innovation and the treatment. So, while it's been a devastating 2 years, the exciting thing is that we had behavior change. And we had behavior change because doctors, providers, patients all realized that they could go virtual and that there were a lot of things that we could do virtually. And it's not just that I can call my doctor about a cold. The reality is it's about changing the site of care and thinking not about the nursing home or the hospital, but in-home care. And so everything we can do like 80% of healthcare can actually be delivered at the home. And that's the exciting thing we're seeing and have been sort of working on and empowering is the virtualization to the home.
Yeah. And a lot of your investments, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
are in that telehealth space.
Yes.
Great. Rod, how about with you?
Yeah, sure. I guess I can kick it off on drugs. Drugs really, I think we're in the early innings of the golden age of medicine, right? And that's probably relatively widely appreciated now, or starting to be. One of the ways I like to think about it, though, to kind of frame how dramatic this time is in the first 100 years, the 19th century, we really had 3 kind of major technologies or modalities that, all the drugs we grew up largely came from. And then the first 20 years of this century, we doubled that number. So we went from 3 to 6. And then now in just the last 2 years, that has added another 3. So when you think about how many drugs that we had, this steady cadence of new innovations of the last 100 years, it's essentially accelerating in exponential fashion because the number of technologies that we have to generate new drugs is going up in an exponential fashion. So, if you look out 5, 10, 25, 50 years from now, I would imagine the number of drugs that we're going to have that, and not just the number, but the quality of those drugs, right? The efficacy and the safety profile will be just something that's hard to imagine from just kind of the framework that we came from in the past.
Great, thank you. Eli, I'll go to you next. I don't know if it was mentioned in the intro, but Eli actually authored a white paper, a black book, titled The Dawn of Molecular Science. This was back in 2011, speaking about a lot of the kind of innovations and progressions in what was at the time an early stage of kind of breakthrough science. So what are you most excited about now today?
I called that a sleep aid. Like anyone that read it immediately fell asleep. I think it's actually just the 2 things said. We invest across the sort of what we say the life science ecosystem. There's a total convergence between what is happening in the tech world and the ability to take data and drive clinical trial recruitments and patient identification, and what Rod's talking about with all the innovation on the sort of therapeutic side. It's just and then I think it's accurate to say that COVID really pulled forward a lot of the things we've been talking about for decades, the potential and just kind of pulled forward all that into the present. And so this sort of convergence concept of technology and biology and this healthcare system coming together. I mean, every day you sort of end your day thinking, oh gosh, it's like, it can't get much better than this. And then like someone calls you in the morning and tells you something even more neat than you learn the next day. And so I think modalities in therapeutics, as Rod said, are exploding. Data is exploding. The diagnostic paradigm, I think, is an amazing change where, you know, our bodies, all the information about our disease or health status is running through our system. We've just never been able to measure it and read it, and that is starting to resolve. And so early detection of cancer and all sorts of illnesses that if you integrate with them early, you can really change the course of the disease. So I just think it's a real convergence of tech and biology.
Thanks, Eli. And Jim, lastly, you, I mean, again, it wasn't mentioned in the intro there, but at Deerfield, beyond just being an investment firm, you're actually operating your own, the Deerfield Institute, very involved in kind of scientific breakthroughs there, and also your own labs. So I'm sure you're at the forefront of seeing a lot of innovative science. What are some of the areas you're most excited about right now?
So, you know, healthcare is really messy, right? You're, on one hand, biology is hard. On the other hand, taking care of people is hard. And all of this is siloed, and those silos are reinforced by reimbursement and other things that makes change hard. And what really makes things change is the availability of clear information. So when we started to have genetic information, it revolutionized the ability to create targeted drugs. We're now starting to have lots of phenotypic data, or like what people look like when they get treated, and following them for years because hospital patient records are available. So you have companies like Trinetics that have 140 million patient records all over the US, Europe, South America, Japan, where you can look at what happened if you treated people in various ways that allows you to think about treatment in the home and treatment in different places and with different modalities in a way that we've never been able to do. And then you have companies like Semaphore that maybe Eli will talk about later that integrate all of these things. So they're integrating genotypic data, they're integrating phenotypic data, and they're thinking about everything from the diagnostic characterization of people through the treatment algorithms to optimize those. And so it really is the convergence in concert with, for the first time, information that can substantiate change.
Yeah,
I think.
So we've talked a little bit about this already, but I'd love to maybe dig deeper, kind of beyond drug development, and not to dismiss the importance of that. I don't think we'd all be here if it wasn't for some of the progression and accelerated ways in which drugs are being discovered, and you know, vaccines clearly being an example of that. But what are some of the other areas of healthcare that you're most excited about beyond drug development? Like I said, we've touched on a little bit of this, but I'd love to hear from each of you. What are some of the other areas you're focusing on? Annie, maybe if we come back to you and start there.
Okay. Well, so I mentioned payment reform is one of those things that has to change along with behavior change. And in my mind, it's the most important thing, because people don't want to feel like the healthcare industry is incented by economics and dollars, but the reality is we're all social beings, we're all economic beings at the end of the day. So we need to pay people in the right way in order to incent the right behavior. And so our focus, is really if you think about the legislative side and the structural side, think about Kaiser. Kaiser is a system where it's providers, but they're also the insurance company. And the most, I think, impactful thing that we've been investing in is primary care, and creating primary care entities that have all the tools, the care managers, the data, the analytics to actually take an individual and support their health, from sort of beginning to end. Primary care docs drive 70% of all healthcare dollars. And yet we pay them $150,000 a year for that one visit, and they're not engaged in in all the aspects of your health and life. So, our view is the hospitals are a cost center. The nursing homes cost center. If you think about driving from the primary care doc forward and giving them much more control and actually rewarding them for that, you really change the system from a hospital-centric system to a care-centric system that's much lower cost and greater access.
Thank you. Rod, how about you?
Yeah, I'll give kind of two areas that we're super excited about outside of drugs. One is what's already been mentioned, this idea of sequencing-based diagnostics, right? So, I mean, if you think about it, we had our first human genome sequence completed. It's been a while, right? It's 20 years ago, but that sequence cost $300 million plus, right? So it really took about 15 years before the cost of sequencing got low enough to really enable all the things that are really now starting to accelerate, right? So sequencing-based diagnostics, I think, is still in the early part of this explosion, this curve. And then within it, specifically, this concept of liquid biopsy, right, which is this idea that you can detect the presence of tumors by sampling DNA that's circulating around in your blood. So that's one. The other is, people talk a lot about AI and the application of AI into healthcare. For a while, I was kind of like, I'm waiting to see it. I mean, it sounds great, but aside from a buzzword, where is the reality? And we are starting to see that. So in medical devices, we've had insulin pumps for a long time, but anyone who's a diabetic or who knows a diabetic knows insulin pumps are really, it's like a lifestyle, right, to manage that pump. And now you have these AI or algorithm-driven pumps that are dramatically changing the quality of life for people who have to use these pumps, right? So the goal is to get to a closed loop system where it's basically hands-free, and the pump itself does all the work for you. And we're seeing new pumps from a couple of companies, both big and then new small ones, like Beta Bionics and Tandem, where we are getting incrementally closer to that goal. So we're excited about engineered AI type solutions in medtech also.
It's fascinating. Thank you. Eli, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, no, I think that first I just, to divorce the sort of what's cool outside of drugs and drugs, I think is probably unfair in the sense that it's not one or the other, right? It's identifying the disease early in the patient, which is a diagnostic data solution, then matching it with a therapeutic that is effective. Where the healthcare is in its best application a solutions provider, and sort of saying this piece and that piece, and then paying the doctor at the end for the work. And so Rod mentioned sequence, which I think is a huge thing to call out because, and I think if we talk about COVID and the story of COVID, if you think about the story of Moderna, right? Here's a company that's probably 4 years old. They've invested enormous amounts of capital. They're actually pursuing things outside of vaccines into cancer and rare disease. I think we've all, Rod and I and Jim, we've all looked at it, different cases, thinking, what could a vaccine company really be worth? I mean, and Stefan Banchel, the journal in January, and reads about some weird influenza outbreak in China. He's doing work with the NIH. He calls them up and says, what's going on? Oh yeah, we just did the sequence. Took 2 days. If you go back to Ebola, it took 2 days to do a sequence and probably cost $1,000. Go back to Ebola, it took 7 months and millions just to sequence. Gets it in 2 days, and 2 days after that, he creates the mRNA vaccine that effectively we're all taking now. That is a 4-year story and a 4-day story, right? And it's a closed loop system from a sequencing solution to an engineering technology to a drug. And so I think there's places in the life sciences to invest in every, from the diagnostic to the manufacturer to the provider to the data. And I think for me, it's you can't separate them all because there's ways to, and what's nice is the margin profile on all this stuff is really good. So there's a good business.
Yeah, great.
Thing about the therapeutic space, and I'm completely on board with the idea that this is a multi-year revolution in drug discovery. It's just there's a finite number of moving parts in the human body. You pick away at them each year. There are fewer left. You figure out how diseases work. You target them. You're going to end up with a drug that. The out is that diseases are smaller and smaller and smaller than you thought, And so we're creating lots of small solutions that cost huge amounts of money. And there's something a little bit frustrating about that. You're no longer impacting broad swaths of people. You're impacting small swaths, and you're charging a lot for it. It's really, I think, value-based care, which is going to create the space for innovation in healthcare. And I think they kind of have to come at the same time. And that gets back to primary care on one hand, but specialty care on the other. So for example, in one case, so there are over 2 million preventable hospitalizations for cardiac patients each year. And part of that is changing the procedures, part of that is prevention. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's related to that. But to change the world to value-based care, you actually have to go and acquire practices and convert them, because the economic equation for them to do it on their own is not there. But once you do that, you can create something that's profoundly important for the patient. It costs less, better experience, and it makes room for innovation. And it accounts for 75% of your healthcare dollars. So I think it's, and by the way, it also takes into account things like the social determinants of health, which are very far afield from drug discovery in some ways. But the things that will impact health most are eating right and things like that that are not well incorporated into our primary care system.
I want to just bridge something that Rod said and that Jim said, which is, and you mentioned a company, Semaphore, that we invested in. And one of the case
3
studies.
out of 4 of us, actually.
Oh, did you? Okay, good. Okay. And maybe Rod's invested too. You can. It's
Apparently,
trading.
I got left out of that party.
you can buy some. It's
Thanks for
trading.
the call.
One of their case studies is, patient shows up one day to the doctor's office, doesn't have diabetes, shows up the next day, has diabetes. Obviously, it was a continuum, which in a transition from a pre-diabetic state to a diabetic state. And that data exists between the genetics and the clinical information. And when you combine it and you bring tools like Tandem and these other things in it, you move the cost of that disease and the morbidity of that disease all the way to the other side. And you have better outcomes at lower cost and sort of happier patients. And so that's sort of that convergence between the tool and the system and the data that brings it together.
Yeah, so that's maybe a good pivot into investing in the private markets and how the 4 of you are working with some of these companies that you're referencing here. I think something that's interesting, all 4 of you, well, 3 of you invest in both public and private markets. Annie, I know that you're exclusively on the private side, but I'd love to talk about and maybe look at some examples from each of you as to how you're working with some of these companies, at what stage, and then how you're ultimately progressing the mission for them. Annie, maybe if we start with you.
So we invest from an idea or an entrepreneur that wants to work with us in creating an idea, a theme, all the way to late stage growth. And I think in all cases, we are intimately, like I have 5 people just on talent. I mean, the amount of money that's been raised and the number of companies that have been started, the biggest issue right now is finding talent. And it's not just, engineering talent is a massive issue, which has been helped by virtualization, right? We can now hire them in Mississippi or, Buenos Aires very easily, and everyone's doing that. But it really is that core talent layer. And I mean, it always starts with the CEO being the hardest to find. But we get intimately involved in the ideation, creation of these companies, as well as just, stepping in. And I think, Deerfield and ourselves have been involved with a company that was going, after home care, initially didn't have the model right at first. We changed out the CEO, we actually reincorporated the company, we took software and then, ended up supporting caregivers in the home as opposed to employing caregivers in the home. And Deerfield came in and, and provided the capital to take it to the next level. So these are, we always say we never leave anyone behind. And our view is it's one of the reasons we are on the board or co-lead or lead everything we do, because we don't let anything die. So we are really partners in the creation and development of these companies.
Great. Rod, I'll come to you next. I mean, I know
Yeah.
If it's all right with you, I'll call Rocket Pharma a baby of yours.
Oh,
in
yeah,
the
sure.
portfolio. So
Yeah.
that's a good example right there.
Yeah, it's a teenager right now. It's causing us some indigestion. But, yeah, no, like similar to what Annie described, we start at idea stage, and then for us, we kind of go through the mature public part of the life cycle, and so we have that kind of flexibility to be invested from kind of the light bulb to as a company gets bigger. Rocket is kind of our shining example. Now, the way we kind of got into private investing by starting from public, and then it was kind of, for us, a natural evolution to reach into the private markets until all the way back to the beginning of the company creation. And Rocket kind of came about that way because we were investing in gene therapy companies, both, first there were very few public, a handful of years ago, but then increasingly private venture funded gene therapy companies. And then what happened was we started encountering these academic programs that had no company sponsorship, but that we said, hey, based on our assessment, there are good odds that this would be a viable therapy, right, for patients. And so we really created that company because we felt compelled that we saw these projects and we're like, these should be medicines. And so the only way to push them forward at this moment is to build a company around it. And so since that time, we've been kind of building up our company creation efforts. I will say one of the very interesting things about how science is evolving is I do think that this trend towards convergence, right, of people kind of spanning the whole life cycle is going to increase, because science used to be 15 years from start to finish, right? And now, in the faster projects, it's less than half of that. COVID's the most extreme example, right? 18 months. And so I think because it's faster, it makes sense that the financial and operational partners, right, that are backing those entrepreneurs will be there for more pieces of that life cycle because it's shorter. So I think that probably is the future. And even though it happened kind of organically for us, I'm glad that we, in hindsight, made those decisions.
Yeah. Eli, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that captures it well. We started with a public-private vehicle, and I would always say, I hope never to invest in a private company, but occasionally it happens, but I'm not a venture capitalist by training or disposition. And Annie said that she never leaves anyone behind, because in the public markets, you can't.
Exactly. You just walk right out the door.
In the private markets, you can't. It became clear, I think it is clear to many of us sitting there, that the public market, it's all early stage investing. It's just different markets. And because we're in this secular growth wave and innovation's happening, if you're not talking to at least private companies, you're only hearing half the story. And then if you're not investing in them, they're only telling you half the story. And if you want that next turn in the road, that next academic program that could change patients' lives, you've got to be there. I think Annie's right. It requires a certain level of engagement with management. We've always been sort of management team engaged, but then you're sort of really putting on the company t-shirt and getting involved, and that's just hard. It's just a lot of time. It's very rewarding. You can create great companies and great value, but you really have to find the entrepreneurs, and I think that's it's just a young industry. So there's not, the diaspora of, Fairchild Semiconductor into Intel and IBM and Xerox and Microsoft. That biotech is on its third generation of companies, the Amgens of the world and then the Regeneron. So there's not a lot of management training. We're pulling them out of the Novartises of the world. But that's a different game than sort of innovative small biotech. So I think it's a talent challenge.
And to clarify, are you helping with this? That's finding, sourcing, placing talent, capital providers. Your involvements aren't just through investment, but actually actively helping in the building blocks. Is that fair?
Yeah, you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul.
I think what Annie and Eli both said is exactly right, which is HR or talent identification is a huge constraint, right? It's becoming a bigger constraint. And the number of people that have had the opportunity, right, that have been given the opportunity to have the experience under their belt is still limited, right? So So then for us, on the investor side, we see more reps at less depth, right? But those reps give us some experience at which we can provide some hopeful, useful guidance and advice to don't make this mistake, don't make that mistake, that kind of thing. And I think that kind of partnership is becoming increasingly important because you don't have enough people, a huge bench of executives that have done it 3 times, right? So that partnership is critical.
Mm-hmm. And then Jim, lastly, you run dedicated private vehicles. You've got lack of a better term, an incubation center, if you will. Maybe talk to us a little about that and to the audience, how you work with some of these companies.
Yeah, so on the biotech side, the problem is when you start with an idea, even with all the data, it's 95% likely to fail. So, these are very, very high risk undertakings. And if you get it from academia, there's a 50% chance that you won't even reproduce the original data. So it's really 2.5%. So we decided the only way to sort of overcome that was to virtualize the process and operate on a marginal cost basis. So we developed relationships with 25 different research institutions for technology transfer. We have a team of 35 senior scientists who review applications and then actually create the discovery plans and then actually execute on those discovery plans. And because of the portfolio mass, we're able to get master service agreements that lower the cost of back to value-based care, of discovery. And probably the biggest key is that, when something starts to fail, we kill it. If you create a company around it, it's going to want to live. And the persistence of those infrastructure costs and the cycles there are what really make the equation, at least in our hands, not work for discovery. So now we're building our own labs that a lot of that work will be done so that we'll be fully integrated on that side. And then on the value-based care side, part of it is coming in late, but a lot of it has been actually constructing the first value-based care companies in certain spaces. I mentioned cardiology before. We've acquired our first practice. Number 2 and 3 are coming. The next step is to convert them to value-based care. With Blue Cross Blue Shield in North Carolina that has about 60% market share, we're acquiring primary care practices for them to roll up into value-based care. And so that's a very, ground up approach to that.
Thank you. So I'll take a little pivot here. This being an economic forum, maybe we could talk a little bit about policy and maybe even government and their involvement in this industry. I'd really love to hear from each of you if you have any thoughts on how policymakers, if there is a different approach that policymakers should be taking to the healthcare system, if there are specific areas you'd like to maybe see change or thoughts, suggestions. Annie, I know you have a few opinions here, so maybe I'll start with you. You're looking eager there to respond to this one.
Well, we'll talk federal, not state. So, it's interesting. I think, Biden, does not want to tackle healthcare. I mean, he feels like, Obama was sort of taken down by Obamacare and couldn't do anything else. And obviously he's focusing on infrastructure and other things. So, my issue right now is that CMS, CMMI are, I feel like they're frozen. And I actually feel like there were good things happening in terms of payment reform, because it really is all about value-based care and getting away from fee-for-service and incenting and focusing on this payment reform. And effectively, what we're talking about, sort of paying for for someone to own the life of that patient and care about that. And Medicare Advantage has been a perfect playpen for that, because the average life of a patient, a member in Medicare Advantage, is 8 years. So somebody's actually incented to take care of them. Think about their health, not avoid health. They're obviously quality ratings. So it's not just about cost. It's also about, it is about ultimately the cost, but it's about the quality, delivered. So I think there's a program called DCE, Direct Contracting entities, that was actually promoted by 2 of my entrepreneurs, Adam Bowler, who ran CMMI, the Innovation Center at CMS, and then Brad Smith, who ran CMMI, the Innovation Center, and sort of laid it out, and and effectively, it's any doctor who has a Medicare patient can effectively sign them up for Medicare Advantage. It's just like this automatic program And it actually gets, the complaint about Medicare Advantage and payers is that that you can play games in terms of coding and coding up. And the reality is in DCE, it's kind of this beautiful program where it's all based on the basically the reimbursement of a region. So it's very hard to actually upcode or play games. It's kind of like, here's the cost of these patients on average in a region. You just have to do better than that. So actually through real care management, real focus on these patients, you have to provide a better experience at lower cost. And basically they've put a stop to that program, and they're supporting what started, and they're going to wait and see 3 years sort of what the results are of that. But it's one of those things where let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, let's get out there. Let's experiment with these models. And get them into the marketplace and not be afraid. I mean, to me, the thing we should be afraid of is fee for service and having what we have, the current system we have today, which is overutilization, which incents it. And, we have, I'm afraid, monopolistic behavior by, hospital systems who own markets. And, and to go back to, one last thing on primary care, I mean, the reality is that most primary care docs, something less than 50%, but the largest percentage is owned by hospital systems. And to me, that's the fox in the hen house, I mean, that's just like, the minute they buy primary care docs, the cost of care immediately goes up 10%. It's really, you've got a cost center that's now controlling the one thing that can actually manage and drive care costs down. So I don't think with lobbyists, effectively, not-for-profit hospitals and hospitals have a lot of sway. They are the largest employer in America. If you look at every state, it's Walmart or it's hospital systems. So it's very hard to change that.
Yeah, hard to break up and
hard to break
intervene.
that.
Yeah.
That's the push we should have.
Yeah. Rod, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, so you can criticize the U.S. healthcare system for a lot of things, but one thing I feel like everyone should be really proud of is that we have the best innovation ecosystem in the world. It's not even close, right? 3/4 of breakthrough therapies and all that come from companies here at home. So to me, the drug pricing debate is this critical thing that we have to get right, because that's the thing where if you get reform wrong, you can break the innovation ecosystem in the US and it can absolutely go somewhere else, right? So the challenge with reform for drug pricing is our system is so complicated, it's really hard to communicate that to voters. So voters then have a view based on very simplistic things, which are not reflective of economic reality sometimes. And then their elected representatives really just want to be responsive to their constituents, right? So it doesn't get more sophisticated than that in a lot of the cases, right? So, but to not break the innovation ecosystem, you have to be sophisticated and make sure you get the right policy solution. So I think that's the tricky bind that we find ourselves in. I'm hopeful that, kind of each round you go through this debate, more and more elected officials kind of appreciate the inner workings or the subtleties to getting that equation right.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting closer to that, right? Yeah. So I'm hopeful. But I still think, everyone talks about it, but it is the most important thing for very good reason. Because all these drugs or products that we're talking about, if we don't get it right, we won't get them, or two, they'll come from somewhere else.
Yeah, when you highlight it that way, it's clearer to see how it is a hard thing to strike a balance on. Eli, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I'm not going to add much more to that. Those very articulate descriptions. To me, it's people in this room, all of us, best healthcare in the world by a factor. Unfortunately, bimodal distribution in this country, vast majority of people in this country have some of the worst and some of the highest prices. That's a societal issue that can't sustain, right? That's just not, and while they don't have access to good healthcare, they have access to their politicians, and this becomes a political debate. The reality is you pull on one string to try to fix it, and it tightens the rat's nest on another. And so I'm not smart enough to know how you untangle that. I don't think drug pricing actually is the problem. If you look at the economic spread, it's 60% are in inpatient, outpatient things, late stage disease, mismanaged. By the way, if you end up in the hospital with a complication of your disease, you are being not treated well. Like going to the hospital is a failure of the system, effectively, right? Because you really should have been captured early. I lean on innovation. That's all I can think about. I think we require, and always have of our companies, to not just provide better solutions, but they have to be better, cheaper to the system. If it's a tandem pump that reduces the sort of burden of disease on a patient, that's you know, it's okay if it charges more incrementally, but it has to be lower cost to the overall system. I do see specifically in the drug pricing debate, we invested in a company called EQRX. There is a wave, you know, because genetics tell you there's a clear target driving this disease, and you can find 100% concordance amongst experts to say, yeah, if you could drug that, you'll change the course of disease. Once a company publishes, you know, IP and creates a structure around that, engineers come in and say, listen, we can create that, and you very quickly get a proliferation of molecules. There's, you know, Keytruda, PD-L1, PD-1s. In the US, 4 approved within 5% price of each other. In China, there's 10, all effectively the same, patently different. In China, they're a tenth of the cost here in the US. Like, that's coming here. That sort of innovation is coming here, which on one end is very disruptive to the companies I'm investing in, right? But on the other end is gonna push everybody to get paid what they deserve to get paid, up the innovation complication side, and models like EQRX, which is saying, give us those sort of third in line, fourth in line drugs that are effectively the same, but too late to the game to pay salespeople to sell it. We're going to match and partner with the payers of the world, the Kaisers and the United Health, and if they don't make us build a sales force, we will contract with them at a lower cost. And we won't just do it on one drug, we'll do it on 10 of the big hits of today while engineering. That's where you all of a sudden do a sort of India cell phone jump over landline infrastructure. And I think we've got to bring the ecosystem closer and sort of start to squeeze the middlemen out. But I'm not as sophisticated about these things as others.
And then Jim, how about you? Any thoughts on this topic?
Well, I definitely think there's been abuses in drug pricing. I mean, you know, we've seen lots of examples of companies that have been poster children for the ability to raise price beyond value, and there are not checks and balances in that system that allow that to occur. And you look at the debate in the House and the Senate right now, and they've gone from, you know, allowing Medicare to negotiate for drugs to focusing on classes like the TNF inhibitors, which are, you know, there's many of them. They've been around for a really long time. They're multi-billions in sales, and, you know, the prices inch up, not down, you know, despite the duration, despite the competition in that class. And so they're talking about legislating competition into classes like that. I don't know where the balance in all of that lies. I do know that if we get value-based care right, there will be a lot of dollars to fund innovation. So to me, there's been this tension between innovation on the value-based care side and society caring about things like drug pricing. Because if we get that right, there's plenty of dollars for every innovation we can make. The one thought I would place on how government applies to this. So within managed care, people turn over about every 3 years, a little bit less than that. Just imagine a world where every drug for every disease could be invented tomorrow, and you let the manufacturers charge whatever they wanted. We have the best generic substitution in the world. So if a drug goes off patent, within 6 months, you've got 95% plus generic substitution. And generics are almost free. They're essentially free. So you could cure every disease. You'd pay the innovators for 20 years, and then those inventions would be with us forever for almost nothing. And to me, that puts in a nutshell, you know, the reason to pay for innovation, because on the other side of it, you basically get a world of disease.
Food for thought there. Well, look, we're pretty much out of time here, so let me use this as an opportunity to thank the four of you. Really interesting conversation. I'm sure our audience appreciates it as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you also for being here.
Yeah.